And we're going to be talking about something for this next hour that I think the past today and yesterday, the discussions we've had up here actually lead to this discussion. This discussion really is where the rubber meets the road, as we say in the U.S. We've talked about Putin. We've talked about where we're going in terms of the war in Ukraine, what trajectory that war is going on. Is it a long war? Is it going to be something short? What will Russia look like? But at the end of the day, if you're NATO and you're a NATO defense planner, or you're a defense planner or a minister in your country, you've got to make some decisions about the forces that you're going to deploy, the equipment that you're going to buy, the fate of the battle groups. How long are we going to be deployed in Romania or wherever? Those are fundamental decisions involving money. And at the end of the day, that's what a lot of capitals right now are trying to figure out, is what does our fate look like? So today, at this panel, I have a wonderful panel of friends and colleagues that I've known for many years that are going to have to help us deal with these questions. And one of our panel members will be making decisions about some of those deployments and the military structures that NATO is going to need into the future, if we can figure out what that future looks like. So let me introduce the panel, and I have 3 questions that I'm going to be laying before them, and we'll see if we can make it through those 3 questions in 1 hour. To my right is Dr. Artis Pabriks. I think you know the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense of Latvia, and it's an honor to have you here.
Thank you.
The second panelist is Patrick Turner. Patrick Turner is also well known in our community. His last job was the former Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning. I will say I used to work in that committee. I know what you were doing, and that's a very important committee. And some of these questions you're going to have to answer for all of us. And finally, a good friend of mine, Andrew Michta, who is the Dean of the College of the International Security Studies at the Marshall Center. If you've been to the Marshall Center, you have seen the handiwork of our panelists, and we certainly appreciate all that the Marshall Center and you have done to help us get at some of these very fundamental questions.
Thank you.
So I'm going to go to the first question. We're going to have a discussion here. We also are going to bring on you to ask questions as well. There's going to be a Slido opportunity to ask questions. I'll keep my eye on that, and we'll see where we are after an hour. So the first question. If you're looking right now at the NATO force deployments that are out there, the battle groups, if you look at what the United States is doing out there on a bilateral basis, many of the nations are doing on a bilateral basis. They have forces out there in Europe. If we actually are going to be faced with a long fight, that this isn't something that's going to be over by Christmas. This is going to be a long fight. How should Allied forces be constituted? What should they look like? And how should they be deployed for a long fight? I can tell you in the Pentagon, they're trying to figure that out. So the question is, what should these forces look like? Is NATO on the right trajectory? Sending out battle groups, doing the things that were decided at Madrid, that we're beginning to implement from the Madrid summit. Is that the right trajectory for the long fight? Is it the right strategy? And does NATO have the right priorities? The NATO defense planners shape the nations themselves. Do we have the right priority? Do we have the right strategy in terms of force employment to handle the long fight with Russia? So I'm going to ask Andrew first, as a defense planner, what you think. And then we're going to turn to a minister who has to make some decisions. And then Andrew will tell us if it's right or not. That's what the Marshall Center does. So Patrick.
Jim, thank you very much. First of all, it's fantastic to be back in Riga. The first time I visited here, I think, was in January 1992. And I think I might have been about the first visitor from the UK Ministry of Defence back then. So you've come a long way. It's great. This terrific country is in NATO. We need you and we admire you. That's the starting point. So super easy questions from Jim, of course. But I'd step back one step and say that we need to be very clear that this is a long fight. I think the official NATO word is a contest. I would, as a minimum, call it a conflict. Obviously, if you're Ukrainian, it's a war. But we are in a contest or a conflict with Russia, and I would contest with China. So this is not just about one country, and I don't think that NATO, the US doesn't think it itself, other NATO allies, European allies can have the luxury of, in the US there's a one major war construct at the moment. I think that's a luxury and possibly an unrealistic luxury. And Europeans can't have the luxury of saying, we'll just think about the problem on our borders, on our periphery, even within Europe. So the US needs to be able to think about Europe and Asia at the same time, and I contend that Europe needs to be able to do the same. It's not good enough to say we'll just mind the shop in Europe. And this is going to be, it will be generational. So it's not just this year, next year, it will be generational. So NATO has been doing some things. I no longer answer directly for NATO because I left in the summer, but it has been doing some things. So it's been raising defense spending, so that is the basis for everything that you could do in terms of force posture, force structures, readiness, capabilities, stockpiles, and so on. So allies, non-US allies spend 70 or 80 billion dollars a year more now than they did a few years ago when they promised to do better. It has been working on having more ready and more available forces at a probably insufficiently ambitious level in terms of quantity, and it has taken further decisions this year. In the summer, the summit in Madrid. So in particular, it said in Madrid that it would have a more ambitious forward presence. Some of us prefer to call that forward defence in the eastern part of the alliance. So battle groups in 8 rather than just 4 eastern allies. And the commitment that those groups could be very rapidly extended to up to brigade level as a minimum, and have the stockpiles, the headquarters structures, the clear commitments by nations that that would be possible. Beyond that, still essentially relatively modest forward presence, NATO leaders also said we're going to have, we're committing to an ambitious so-called new force model. So I'm not going to get into defence planning geekery. So Jim, even if you
will,
want...
I'm going to drive you there over the course of this hour.
Yes, so you can lure me later on. But that basically, they said, we commit to having over 100,000, well over 100,000 very high readiness forces and around 200,000 high readiness forces. So a much more ambitious level of commitment than the previous so-called NATO readiness initiative. And we're going to set a very ambitious timetable for that. So we're going to identify those forces and commit those forces within the next year or so, and those forces will be connected to our new set of defensive operational plans. So I'd say some of this is in place. I would personally go further in terms of the extent of the forward posture. I think we will have to do that. Defense spending, the targets need to be even more ambitious. And as part of that, last point, you know, the US has made additional deployments in Europe, in the east of Europe. That is terrific. That was done very fast. But I would say, again, we need to go further.
But the question also becomes, is this sustainable? Is this, if we're going to have a long fight, and all this costs money, and we all have our fingers crossed that the nations will be able to provide the funding and the readiness and the forces themselves to take on these jobs. But is this sustainable for a year or two? Is this something, particularly if there's going to be great demands on domestic spending because of energy and this type of thing, is this going to work? And in Washington, I know that's the concern is, will we be able to do the things that we agreed to at NATO and keep it sustained? Minister, let me ask you, you all agreed to this at Madrid, and we're all hopeful that this is going to happen. Your country, the other Baltic nations, those on the front lines, this is something that's critical. It's absolutely critical that we do what we said we would do in Madrid. What do you think? Is this going to be something that's sustainable for a long fight?
Well, somehow today I think in quotes of old samurai sayings. For instance, as you train, so you fight. Or there could be another quote that the road to victory is littered by ignorant.
Right.
In that sense, of course, the decisions and rewards we politicians use are always correct as far as our planning. But let's be honest, we did not expect we will be in such a situation where we are at this moment, at least most of our allies were not thinking it will be so serious. Now, is the direction correct and is it sustainable? Yes, the direction and the words are correct because we all understand that the situation is becoming more and more grave. And my assessment would be that, for instance, Russia together with Belarus, regardless of the outcome of the war, and with an outcome of the war, I understand Ukrainian victory, but the victory might have a different degrees as well. I do not accept anything else as Ukrainian victory because that would be immediately or later on, but that would be just an invitation for the next war with Russia.
That's right.
So we need a victory. Now, the direction is right, but the preparedness, of course, capabilities, and also, let's say, political readiness to grasp this, to bring it to our increasingly fragmented societies, is still missing. Now, as far as capabilities, yes, we had a certain success with Madrid summit about getting acceptance, for instance, in the Baltic countries, including Latvia, that each of us will host an international brigade, where we had a friendly fights also with Mr. Turner during the Midsummer's Eve night when I was drinking beer and writing, emails.
He told me he apologizes for that.
No. He was doing his job, I was doing my job. And we succeeded together. But these battle groups, we all understand it will take also time. We also know that there are limits of capabilities of our allies, but we don't have another way how simply to proceed and to station them here as soon as possible. The second thing is provisions. We know that looking to the Russian invasion in Ukraine, where it is kind of a classical, almost Second World War invasion, where sometimes the shells, the number of shells fired by cannons, howitzers are per day 50, 60,000. I mean, what about our stocks?
Yeah.
What about our production? Please tell me how many factories in Europe are producing, for instance, powder for bullets? I don't think there are so many. This is one of the reasons why, for instance, we in Latvia started a big stress with this military industry production, because one thing is the wording, another thing, we can't rely. I mean, if we have stocks only for a few days, what we will do? And we must understand this. And the third thing is, of course, a political willingness to grasp the reality, not to be that ignorant which is littered on the road once we go towards the victory, because sometimes we are paying too much of a lip service to our political partnerships, of course, let's allow me, I mean, you know, I'm usually in conferences extremely restricted with my words, but let's allow me to mention just one example, battle group in Hungary, which is at this moment even not willing to be a transit country for military hardware for Ukraine. That gives me, honestly speaking, a very, very big question mark in both of my eyes, you know. Now, another thing is why, for instance, when we discuss usually this question about American presence in Baltic countries or in Europe in general, first, presence, second, geographical presence. And I will start with the second one. When we were discussing in a friendly manner these battle group issues before Madrid and Brussels and in Madrid, I was actually asking American colleague Lloyd Austin, you have HIMARS systems in Germany. I mean, what do you want to shoot to Poland? The range is up to 300. Why don't you station them in the Baltic countries? Why do you station them in Germany? And I think this is a practical question because we do want as soon as possible to purchase such systems. It's not a secret, including also the air defense systems, because when our public sees how Ukraine is bombed, obviously I, as a minister, I am asked, how will I defend my people? What shall I answer? How many actually Patriot systems or NISAM systems are available and who is willing to contribute? So, obviously, this is a political decision, this is industrial decision, and this is also the capability decision. Yes, we are on the right mood and the right direction, but looking from the Latvian perspective, where we are a frontline country, and not the only one, our question is, of course, about timing, because timing always matters.
And that's a critical point. And Andrew, this is something for you to take on, but just to throw on the table, at the last defense ministerial, ministers agreed to a European air and missile defense system. I'm not sure what to call it yet. It was a bit vague in the news. I'll leave it to you to tell us what it is. But it raises exactly the point you're talking about: is what's the lag time for delivery of whether it's HIMARS or whether it is Patriot or SAMP-T? I mean, wherever it might come, we've got some real supply chain problems that can be measured in terms of years.
Well, we can intervene immediately. Or
yeah,
no?
yeah.
You know, I was almost woken up by this message that we will now create this European air defense system, and Ukrainian partners already have been catching this catchy phrase and telling, look, and maybe Ukraine will be also included in this air defense, and
right.
Europeans are finally doing this. I mean, it sounds great, and it's frequently on the news, and in different press releases sounds great, but let's be realistic. With our capabilities, with our willingness, with our industries, what, a decade?
Yeah, if
How
that,
much?
if that.
Or 15 years?
Yeah.
What do we answer today?
Yeah.
What I tell to, and I'm grateful to our Spanish colleagues here about one NASAM system, but we have for whole Latvian territory only one NASAM system. Where are our other allied NASAM or Patriot systems?
Yeah. Well, Andrew, that's a question for you. If we're on the right trajectory and we're doing what needs to be done, and we're going to have this system that was just announced at the Defense Ministerial, is this going to happen? How credible is this? Is Putin shaking there in the Kremlin that this is getting ready to happen? Or what do you think? Where are we on this?
Well, thank you for having me here. And let me preface my comments that I'm speaking in my private capacity, not on behalf of the Marshall Center of the Defense Department or the U.S. government. Artis has identified something that is very, very important here. The structure of deployments, the agreements at NATO, that's one thing. The actual determination to move forward with speed when it comes to building capabilities, fielding capabilities, supplying stocks of munitions, supplying missiles, looking at the current paucity of stocks that we have. We're on the 23rd drawdown in the United States right now, the last 725 million. And what the minister has pointed out, if you look at the rate at which stocks are being expended, it's not just that we have a brigade here or force posture here or there, it's what will they be supplied with to sustain the kind of rates of attrition of munitions, stocks, and supplies. You know, at the rates that he just described, you know, it's not just the artillery shells, it's the barrels that need to be replaced after 4,000 or 5,000 rounds have been fired. It's the logistical chain, the ability to support. I mean, I think if we've learned anything from this war, that without the Americans, and I'm not trying to be arrogant or proud here, but without the Americans, the kind of logistical operation that we're seeing would not have been possible. So this brings me to my key point here on this. We have a politically unified NATO, which is a huge achievement, the fact that we have made these decisions in Madrid. But I think we still have something that I called in an article I wrote recently, a crisis of disbelief. That is that as you move across Europe, and when I talk to different politicians or analysts or military guys, I think the military guys get it, but I think in the political class, there's still a sense of suspended disbelief.
Right.
And this is, in my view, a system-transforming war. I mean, as Art has pointed out, if Putin wins, this is a civilizational transformation in Europe. That's why anything short of the defeat of the Russian military in Ukraine would have grave, if not disastrous, consequences for European security, for transatlantic relations, and global security writ large. One more point that I always try to convey is the sense of urgency that we need to have. You know, since 2012, we've had this debate in the United States about pivot to Asia. You know, then we called it rebalancing. You see in Washington the discussion today, Ukraine is a distraction, don't look there, China is the real fight. I always tell my friends, don't listen to what people say, look to what they do. And the speed with which the Biden administration responded to this crisis tells you a lot, okay? Right. I said to one of my colleagues in Washington who kept talking about pivot, I said, well, the United States is both the Atlantic and the Pacific power. We're a continental island writ large. We don't pivot. And great powers don't pivot, ask my British colleagues, right? So we need to get across in Europe a clear sense that we have a firestorm brewing in the Indo-Pacific that is going to draw the United States' attention inevitably in that direction, even though it's mainly a Navy's fight, you know, and Europe is a different theater. But if the Europeans don't step up quickly enough in the next few years, and Europe is disarmed, let's be honest about it. The last 30 years have been a complete disarmament of most European militaries. Defense budgets were treated as purses from which you draw, you know, for other social projects and whatnot. I think the United States is determined to bridge in capabilities for Europe for the duration, but Europe needs to build up sufficient deterrent capabilities to ensure that if the US power is pulled in a different direction, with the nuclear guarantee remaining, with high-end enablers remaining, but that Europe must provide the bulk of European conventional deterrence.
Minister.
Yes, sorry for intervention, but here we have actually two angles of American presence in Europe, and let's be very frank about this. The one angle is, of course, Americans were providing Europe with security, practically, technically, militarily, because Europeans were living a, beautiful life, enjoying freedoms and etc., while Americans were arming. That's simply a technical part. Actually, we can overcome that because many European countries understand they have to invest more in military. They can do this if they want. But looking from the Latvian or Baltic or Northern European perspective, it's not only the question about European capabilities, but about European mindset and willingness really to stand and to risk with their lives when this is critical for some of their partners. And this is why we have been let's say, or I was so explicit about these questions previously, because, for instance, I do not doubt a German, French, or any other soldier, but soldiers are actually doing what politicians tell them to do. So the question is, will there be enough of political willingness once it comes to the hour where we have to decide to do something? And if Americans leave Europe, we have, let's say, an angst at this stage at least, and hopefully this is a false alarm, I hope so. We still have an angst that if Americans will be out of continent, then we might run into trouble as far as political decision making, not only with capabilities. Right. This is why we are struggling with all our hands and minds to keep Americans in Europe.
Well, I'm going to depart from the script a little bit and play on this mindset issue, and also this issue about a European Plan B if, in fact, U.S. forces have to be either whole or in part sent to the Pacific. What happens then? Who can fill the void? Can we fill the void? I think, obviously, we've heard over the past few minutes, there's some doubt, given where we are now, that we can quickly in Europe rise up and fill a void left by the United States. Patrick, I'm going to put you on the spot here. You're no longer at NATO, but you're a defense planner. This Plan B kind of thing is something that certainly SHAPE is thinking about. If the U.S. pulls forces, where might they come from? You might not, this is SHAPE, this isn't the Defense Planning Committee, but where might they come from in terms of U.S. forces leaving a void? What European forces might need to be put there? What needs to be done today to get ready for that? So we're not caught flat-footed should this nightmare actually come true and we have to move over there. What should we be doing now? What should NATO and defense planning be doing now to deal with not just that Plan B, but also taking advantage of this mindset issue too? That there is, I've seen this over the past few days, there is the beginning of a change of this mindset, but sometimes that change can happen too late. Yeah. So, Patrick, what's your feel with all of this?
So first of all, I think the mindset change needs to go further. So it's a very good start, but we have not used plain language. Our politicians have not, in many places, sufficiently narrated the extent and the length of the challenge and how serious it is, and that it's in some ways existential for all of us. This is about the future of all of our societies. So there is nowhere to hide in this global contest. So that's one. We're going to have to be have a much better narration, because there are going to be a lot of headwinds and people's. This is a 10 or 20 year project. Second. We need in Europe at least, so this part of the security, a compact between Eastern allies which feel under more or less direct existential threat and Eastern allies which need to be reinforced, other European allies and the US. So this is a game with three sets of players, and they all need to play, and they all need to show that they're playing. And as it happens, I think that all three of those sets of players are more willing to play than has been the case for a long time.
Is it too late?
But will they do it? So no, I don't think it is too late. It's later than it should be. It's quite a few years later than it should be. We could have woken up probably a good 10 years ago, and President Putin's been advertising his agenda for a very long time, and we've been scrupulously turning our head the other way. But it's not too late. The new force model that I was talking about, 300,000 ready or very ready forces, that will help potentially do something to help now. But also, I think, as the Minister was saying, stockpiles. We should be reconstructing the sort of stockpiles that should have existed 5 and 10 years ago right now, not just for supplying Ukraine, but we should have it for ourselves. So Ukraine certainly, but start with being serious. So we need to demonstrate by every possible means, money, capabilities, readiness, stockpiles, presence, that we're serious. Last point, as I said at the beginning, I don't think it's good enough for Europe just to say to the US, we understand you have your top priority is Asia, the pacing threat, as the Pentagon calls it, and good luck over there, and we'll continue just obsessing about one thing over here. For an ambitious, capable, rich continent, that is not good enough. So Europe also needs to be thinking, what can it do to help American friends on the other side of the world?
No, thank you very much. That would have been my job to say exactly what you did, and I appreciate that. One more point, and then to the Minister, and then Andrew, I think you'll have something to add too, but what you're also talking about is European defense industry, because in terms of making powder in Europe, who does that? Well, this is something that is part of this whole effort to try to be ready, is that European defense industry has got to be in a place that it can do this at scale. That's not where they are now. I remember myself during, the Kosovo air campaign and also over Libya, there's certain allies that ran out of ammunition within a day. And so this is something that is a very real problem that we have known about for a long time. Minister, and then Andrew.
Yeah, once more to reiterate. First of all, I really believe, for the sake of security and political decision-making and psychology, even if Americans, and actually also us as Europeans, we are facing increasing challenges in Pacific, Americans must stay in Europe. Secondly, we cannot live in a visionary world of wishful thinking, and we understand in the Baltic area and the North European areas that our perception of threat is actually still different from that in the countries which is further away from Russia. That's the reality. That's a fact if you go on the streets and ask people. So where to get those resources? I would say that at this moment, I personally, if it's in my hands, I would very much rely on the more consolidated approach among the countries along the Baltic Sea. Our new members, Finland and Sweden, they can look Putin into eyes. They understand what is the seriousness of the situation, otherwise they would not join. Poland, which is really investing in military, and thanks to Poland, you know, Europe is starting to look different. And we, as the friends of Ukraine, those who were contributing, like my country, the most to Ukrainian defense, actually we have to be the, not only allies, but assistance to Ukraine to integrate in this area. So actually, in the short run, while psychological preparedness and resilience in other European countries are getting on the same level to understand the threat, more integration of the Northern Europe, including Poland and Ukraine after the war, that would be the key.
Andrew, commentary on everything that you've heard, and then we're going to talk about NATO and the nuclear card. Andrew.
I think what I'm hearing is that at the core, the problem is political still. We are politically unified as an alliance, but as you move across the continent, you've got a very different level of appetite for risk-taking. And so that creates a sense of kind of regionalized security optics. And as the minister pointed out, if you're on the flank, it's all about Russia. Because for a country like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, a lost war is an existential question. There's no do-over. I mean, they've been there, they've done that, they know what it means. Also, all other East European, former Soviet bloc countries have a very keen sense of the Russian threat. And they understand the importance of this near-imperial drive. I think as you move farther away, you don't have the urgency of being immediately on the flank. You know, France is very preoccupied with Africa, with the Mediterranean, with the southern issues. And I'm not passing judgment here, I'm just saying we need to find a way on the fundamentals to agree that in an all-out crisis, we will step up. And the most important thing that I'm missing here in this conversation, and that's across the West, I think we have not mobilized the public opinion. We have not explained to the public what's truly at stake. And until that happens, any decision to continue to aid Ukraine becomes subject to political infighting on domestic issues. There is no mobilized democratic base, if you will, small d, that gives the politicians the leeway that they need to make tough decisions. So I would love to have this kind of direct conversation. Frankly, I would like to get our people in the media to get involved in this as well, you know, to communicate what the situation is.
So whose job is it to do that? Is that something, I'm thinking I would love to have Joe Biden get on television and address the American people on this, but that's not all of Western Europe. Is it each individual nation, they do it in their own way, or they don't do it at all? Is it the European Union that should do it? NATO Secretary General? I mean, who should be leading this effort to do exactly what you said, which is to explain the importance of this? Whose job?
I think it's national leadership at every level, then NATO, then the EU. NATO is the premier security organization, you know, defense organization that we have. EU, to me, is always a bit of an awkward bird when it comes to hard security issues. It's tried different things. Most importantly, we need to have a conversation of how to secure Ukraine. because talking about EU enlargement into Ukraine, in my humble opinion, is to some extent deflecting the issue.
Right.
No private equity will go into a country that's under constant threat of being destroyed, attacked, mutilated, and what have you. So we need to have a conversation within the alliance about how to secure Ukraine, whether through membership in the alliance or some other formula where the security of the country is guaranteed. I think if we don't get to that point, we will not be able to talk about EU enlargement, economic reconstruction, and what have you. And remember what's riding on this. A successful, democratic, free Ukraine, sovereign Ukraine, changes the region. I cannot imagine Belarus remaining in this kind of Russian embrace for much longer with that kind of a change taking place right next door.
Right.
And you have a region, there are no one-country solutions to the security dilemmas here. It has to be a region-wide solution. One last comment on Finland and Sweden coming in. This is truly transformative. This is transformative because it changes the geostrategic depth of the Baltic states. I mean, I'm speaking in Riga, right? So this is extremely germane. For way too long, we talked about the security of the Baltic states in a bit of a theoretical fashion about how we're going to defend, what we're going to do, tripwires, these kinds of things. You now have a geostrategic depth from the high north, Norway, Sweden, Finland, the Baltic states. You're talking about an air force capability that's going to come online like nobody's business.
Yep.
So this is huge. This is a tectonic shift in European security. We should capitalize on that.
So we have 15 minutes left, and I want to do the nuclear question, which is on everyone's mind, and then we've got some excellent questions coming up on the Slido, and we want to get to hand raises there too. And so what I'm going to do is do a quick one on the nuclear card, and then we're going to turn to the audience and to Slido. Here's the question. The alliance nuclear posture, nuclear sharing, the NATO planning group, MPG work, I'm sure you're familiar with some of that nuclear task that NATO takes on. Does that need to be rethought given that the nuclear card has been played now? In other words, NATO has pedaled on doing this nuclear business in the MPG and, quietly getting briefed by the United States and the other nuclear members on what's going on, for many years. It's on autopilot. Given the fact that the nuclear card has now been played by Putin, he's put it on the table. It's no longer something theoretical. As NATO thinks about the nuclear part of its context, as it thinks about fighting in Europe, defending allies, that nuclear aspect has become even more important. It's no longer just a theoretical thing for the MPG. So usually in the alliance, when people think about the nuclear side, it's a U.S. thing. Well, the U.S. is going to brief us. The U.S. is going to be the one to pull the trigger. It'll be a U.S. decision, et cetera, et cetera. Let's put the U.S. aside, okay? Let's look at this question in terms of NATO. If you're on the MPG, Patrick, this is coming to you. If you're on the MPG, if you're running that committee, and you're sitting down right now, are you saying, we're going to have to rethink this whole thing in terms of the NATO role? We're going to have to, it just can't be business as usual. We're going to have to talk to the Americans in a month, and the alliance, are going to have to suggest maybe some other approaches in terms of NATO involvement and that nuclear part of Article 5. Is that happening? Should that happen? Or really things are fine, Jim? Let's move on to another question. Patrick.
So thanks for a super easy question. So firstly, I would say that Russia has not actually played the nuclear card. It said there is a nuclear card. It's waved it around.
But to me, that's playing it. It's
yes,
just
okay,
waving it. That's been played.
That's fine, but it is, people use the term saber rattling. So it's making a lot of noise. It has not actually done very much. So I'm not saying it's impossible that they would follow through on their noisy threats, and we can't say it would be impossible. So that's point one. I'm not sure that we're that much closer to a danger of a country using a nuclear weapon for the first time since 1945. So point one. Point two, I don't think I accept your premise that you can kind of forget the individual allies, starting with the US, who have their own nuclear deterrence. So there are three, US, UK, France, and then NATO has a collective deterrent, US weapons flown on the aircraft of a number of allies and supported by the aircraft.
But you're the NPT chairman.
Yes, so, but I'm saying point one on nuclear is if you are President Putin and you are thinking unwise thoughts in relation to Russian nuclear capability, you have to compute 4 centers of decision making. So you can't assume I can sort of prevent NATO from acting by one ally saying we're uncomfortable. But nuclear evidently matters. So it's still, you know, NATO says the chance of the use of nuclear weapons is very remote. I don't think that's stopped being the case. But having a functioning, clearly functioning and credible and demonstrated NATO and then those national nuclear deterrents matters more than ever.
And do we have that now? Or
Yes.
do we have to rethink it? I think
No,
we do have it now, but
we do, and you know, NATO just did an annual exercise. We've been rather more open about that the last couple of years than in the past. I think that's a good thing. So it should not be something that looks as though it's a response to a particular moment or a particular statement. Where it's a responsible thing to have a functioning, up-to-date, safe, secure and effective nuclear deterrent, because that's the foundation for all of our defense.
then I'm going to skip to the secondary question, which I know you're ready for, and that is, if a tactical nuclear weapon is used by Putin in some respect, whether it's a demonstration shot or it's actually on the battlefield, etc., a lot of times that usage by Putin is also a finger in the chest to the United States. In a sense, it's a challenge to the United States. It's like, okay, U.S., what are you going to do, you in the West? Let's put that aside. I know you don't like me to do that, but let's put the U.S. aside. And in Brussels, at NATO headquarters, what should NATO do? Should a section make a statement saying this is unacceptable? You know, should, you know, what should a NATO reaction to that be more than verbal? Or does NATO just sit back and say, U.S., over to you?
So, point one, Russia knows, you know, NATO says Russia knows that a nuclear war should never be fought and could never be won.
Right.
2, if anybody, anywhere, in any circumstance used a nuclear weapon, demonstration shot or use on the battlefield, that changes the game absolutely. It breaks a taboo which has existed for very good reasons and has been maintained during some very, very tough times. So let's hope that that remains the case. 3, the US, NATO, others have said there would be severe consequences, and those have been, we've communicated with Russia about that. But I would say one of the principles of effective deterrence, whether it's nuclear deterrence or conventional deterrence, is you don't tell your adversary in advance what that means. You don't make it simple for them. You don't say, well, we promise that if you do that, then we won't do that. That's bad deterrence. So if you ask me, what would we do? I might give you some kind of answer, but I would not start dividing up the circumstances in which a particular response was going to be made.
Even under Chatham House rules, you wouldn't tell us a little bit. No, just kidding. Well, thank you very much, Minister. Certainly this has been on your mind as well, and I know Andrew has a view on this too. So a NATO role, and also NATO use of a nuclear weapon, what would NATO do besides a statement from the section? What do you think?
Well, of course, Latvia is a non-nuclear country yet, but obviously that is a serious thought, because obviously nuclear deterrent is the best deterrent against any kind of invasion, and that must be taken highly seriously. Otherwise it will really not work, and this either rattling or playing of Putin with a nuclear card all the time before 24th of February and after, of course, makes us also in defense sector to consider this issue very seriously, because we have to plan for the worst possible scenario ever, and if we are wrong, then we are simply wrong and we are happy and going home to our families. Now, nuclear as a deterrent. I really agree with what the previous speaker told, that to tell your plans before, this is, I would, you know, that there have been some politicians telling this. I would call it kind of would subscribe this to the moment of analytical weakness, but obviously you should not tell what you will do, because it's like, you know, going into the ring of boxing and telling, oh, you can beat me in the face, but I will never beat you in the face. So, okay, so why do you go there? So I believe that Russians must be communicated, and they are communicated, that it will be highly serious, and the answers can be different, but it must be so serious that Russia understands it without words. And I simply would add that it's not only 4 countries. I would even claim that it's 5 countries, it's including China, because Chinese position, either open or not open, can be extremely important also once we speak to such a, let's say, poker players like Putin. So that's important to remind.
Yep.
Andrew.
I think what Patrick said is very important. I think we're falling prey to our own, I call it self-deterrence, by signaling, instead of maintaining strategic ambiguity, signaling what we will not do, and then allowing the adversary to maintain the initiative. I think the means are there when it comes to NATO and the United States. And I think what I would simply do is communicate in no uncertain terms that there would be a response, and an overwhelming response, and I would leave it at that. I would let the Russians continue to guess. Remember that he created a pseudo-event. That's absolutely true. He didn't put the card on the table. He waved it, and like in any information operation, emotions go up, we get spun up, we get to debate amongst ourselves, set limits. The French say they would never respond in nuclear weapons, and it all goes on and on and on. Enough. I think that that's not the way to do this, especially vis-a-vis a player like that. And I think, you know, it's not just the Chinese, I think Artis is right, but also India would have something to say on the subject.
Oh, yes.
I mean, this would be crossing the thresholds. And I am not saying that you can exclude this. Nothing is impossible. I'm looking at a thug who has used military power repeatedly and got away with it, 2008, 2014, 2015, and on. But I think that this is such a major threshold.
Yep.
That until I see some real evidence that he is moving in that direction, I would still maintain that threshold is relatively low.
Patrick.
So a couple of extra thoughts. One, if something were to happen, and I think it's still only a small possibility, that possibility has not gone up very much. In reality, there aren't any signs that it is actually going up in practice. It would be an absolute counsel of despair on the Russian part, a counsel of despair, a clear sign of failure, not success. 2, it would have catastrophic consequences. So I'm not describing necessarily military consequences for Russia. Indeed, you know, perhaps you'd end up kissing goodbye to any support or tacit support from other countries like India and China. And 3, if, as Andrew's saying, the West is united now, we are united now within NATO and much more broadly than that, today's unity would look weak by comparison with the unity which would flow. So it wouldn't, I would not forecast that it would divide us. It would consolidate and accelerate and add to the determination. And so, you know, there's doubling down is not an option available only to one side in this contest.
Excellent, excellent. Andrew, did you have a...
Just a two-finger comment. I was listening to Patrick. So remember that an inadequate response from NATO and the US side in particular would reverberate in the Indo-Pacific.
Right.
Because the security architecture in the Indo-Pacific is much more balance of power, less institutionalized, less driven by organizational bureaucratized structure, and it rests on US security guarantees fundamentally. So a weak response or a non-response in Europe would have immediate consequence across in the Pacific.
So we have 3 minutes, and I also want to have some final remarks by our colleagues. I'm going to ask the question off the Sligo. What role does PESCO play in securing Europe? I wanted that question to be put to you because this is This is a tool that the EU has, that Europe has, to try to very quickly gain some ground on these issues that we've been talking about in terms of European capability. So it's not just PESCO, but what role do you see in the toolbox right now for the EU to be able to make some progress on the capabilities that we know Europe needs to bring to the fore? Lightning round, very quick.
Well, if I would like to be positive about quick moves in European Union and PESCO, then I would say first it should concentrate only on those areas which are not covered by NATO. Secondly, it could really give some assistance for European capabilities as far as industrial might, military industry, and not concentrating only on the existing large Western European concerns, but giving a share to countries like us. Otherwise, it will not work.
Right. Andrew. Well, Patrick. Patrick.
So, European defense spending, European capabilities, European forces, European readiness, European production capacity, all of them, let's have as much as possible. And forget all of the boring inter-institutional dynamics. I couldn't care less about that. So the more Europe, the better.
And the less petty back and
yeah,
forth.
This is too serious to start, worrying, playing silly institutional games.
Andrew.
Yeah, I mean, I think the EU has been great at multiplying institutions and committees and names and organizations. It's really about building real exercise military capabilities, making sure that bridges and overpasses are rated for 70 tons to carry armor on a trailer, doing practical things. I think we're not going to move the needle forward by just debating, what role this or that institution should play. It's past that time.
Okay, 30 seconds, each one of you. What do you want us to leave with in terms of what we've been talking about today, the challenges ahead? What do you want us to understand as we go back and go to dinner?
That our deeds are corresponding our words. Get serious, understand the threat, and work, and then talk.
Totally agreed. If in doubt, get a bigger map and a bigger timescale. Multiply everything that we've been talking about by 10 in terms of scale and speed. So bigger, better, faster, longer.
Andrew, last word.
Last word.
Be profound.
Have some strategic imagination and courage. I mean, what's happening is a conflict that happens once every 4 or 5 generations. We're looking at the crush zone of Europe that has generated wars, mayhems. Cold War was fought over this terrain and the rest of it. And that's the first thing. And the second thing is be mindful that the principal force in the United States is the US Congress on this score. It doesn't happen every day that the administration asks for 30 billion and gets 40 billion. But it takes two to tango. So if Europeans start once again welching on spending money, building capabilities, this may turn, and this may be a very different situation. So make sure that you send the right message to the US Congress by stepping up, producing, building weapons and ammunition, rearming. I know it's going to take time, but if you're moving in the right direction, we'll be with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a round of applause for some very important points that have been made here.
Thank you so much.
Well done.
Very good.
Always a pleasure.